When it comes to assessing Genshin Impact's game design, comparisons to Breath of the Wild are difficult to avoid. So, for the sake of addressing this early, yes, Genshin Impact does take a large amount of inspiration from Breath of the Wild when looking at the game's exploration mechanics and UI. However, through its combat and a number of different elements that are not present in Breath of the Wild, the game manages to carve out an identity of its own. Whether or not this identity lends itself to a game that leaves a long-lasting and favorable impression remains to be seen, but at the very least, the opening parts of the game provide enough fun and intrigue to have kept me playing every day since its launch. Before we dive into the game, I would first like to address the game's recent anti-cheat controversy. For those of you unfamiliar with the issues caused by anti-cheat software, TechWiki does a good job of summarizing these problems, and I will leave a link to the video in the description down below for those of you that wish to look further into this, as they can do a much better job of explaining the issue than I can. In regards to Genshin Impact's own version of anti-cheat, the first issue is that it runs at the kernel level, which gives it a priority over a large number of programs that a computer would normally run. And in turn, this can cause performance issues across many PCs. Valorant, by Riot Games, recently suffered a backlash due to their anti-cheat software running even after the game was closed, which caused PC issues for many players of that game. Genshin Impact, during its launch, suffered the same problem, but MiHoYo recently reported that they have since corrected this and the anti-cheat now shuts off when the game closes. Since the issue was fixed quickly, this is relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, but I felt that I should mention it for those more cautious of anti-cheat software. There have also been some accusations that MiHoYo may have been installing spyware along with its anti-cheat system, but the company has denied allegations of this, and the digging that I did do into this accusation didn't reveal much in the way of evidence. I have included links to the articles discussing all these issues in the description down below for those of you that wish to look into this more. Moving on to the game itself, I will attempt to be as objective as possible with my first impression / assessment of this game. But I do admit to any bias that may be the result of my own preferences. If there is something that I have said that you disagree with, or I happen to have gotten something wrong, please let me know. Feedback and constructive criticism will always be appreciated. The opening of Genshin Impact has the problem of somehow saying too much and too little at the same time. The introduction of your main character, the Traveler, is done in a flashy anime sequence that, while certainly entertaining, drops a load of information that may be a bit much for newcomers. In addition to this, the abrupt time jump after the intro, as well as the introduction of the game's helper character, Paimon, happens fast enough that it feels as if you were dropped into the middle of a story, rather than the beginning, and can cause some confusion rather than intrigue into the game's overall world. At the very least, the intro establishes a clear objective that the player can easily follow: save your sibling, and from there drops you into the world through a series of brief tutorials that reveal the game's combat and exploration mechanics. Genshin Impact is designed as an action / exploration based RPG, and from the hours that I have played, it is clear that the game took a significant amount of inspiration from Breath of the Wild in terms of exploration mechanics and world design. Is that a knock against the game's quality? Not at all, as I find their execution of these exploration mechanics, while not as polished as Breath of the Wild, still tend to be satisfying and fun to do. Often I would find myself straying away from the main quest to explore bits of the environment, searching for any hidden locations or treasures that lay off the beaten path, and to my joy was rewarded for these efforts throughout the world. World bosses, grand vistas, hidden chests, and random enemy encampments fill the world of Teyvat with plenty of activities to do, and I've enjoyed what I've seen so far in the 8 to 10 hours that I've spent with the game. I do have some issues with how slow the climbing speed is, as it practically forces you to constantly jump while climbing, but compared to everything else they've done with the world, that is a relatively small complaint. Combat is where Genshin Impact sets itself apart from Breath of the Wild. Instead of relying on one character and a set of items, the game's combat is more about the synergistic interaction between the party members that you collect and their abilities. On the surface, the combat appears to be very simple, as the character has access to only one combo, a charged attack, a special attack, and an ultimate attack. Sprinting is also tied into combat, as the initial dash of your sprint can act as a dodge roll to get you out of harm's way. And while there is a jump button in the game, you only have access to an airborne slam attack when jumping off high cliffs or elevated ledges. The complexity of the game's system emerges when you start to combine character abilities and combos into one another to bring about different synergies. Each character in the game is assigned a respective element, and it is usually special attacks or ultimate attacks that apply elemental effects to enemies. Alone, An elemental effect doesn't do much, but when combined with another element, the resulting synergy results in a much more powerful effect. These synergies are your key to defeating enemies in a fast and efficient manner, as the basic combo and charge attacks, while certainly effective as a means for consistent damage, can't really match up to the pure burst damage of these combinations. However, this goes beyond damage, as certain abilities can also provide defenses and even healing to your party depending if specific conditions are met in the middle of battle, which adds a level of strategy to fights against harder enemies. Typically, enemies are fairly easy to fight through when traversing the world of Teyvan, but the further you travel, you will find that your characters are not the only ones with access to elements. Elite enemies are littered throughout the world that also possess the ability to trigger elemental effects, and your characters are just as vulnerable to these effects as they are. From what I have seen, there are a total of 7 elements within Genshin Impact, each with their own synergy to one another. While the characters you get tend to fall into a small field of archetypes or classes, they all possess different special attacks and ultimates, and as a result, there's a lot to party composition when tackling the more challenging parts of the game. When you tie this into different enemy vulnerabilities and defenses, along with some environmental effects, there's potential for a deep and rewarding combat system that, so far, has proven to be a satisfying and rewarding experience. However, despite these solid gameplay pillars, much of Genshin Impact's future will be dependent on how fair its gacha system proves to be. For those of you unfamiliar with gacha games, these are games that allow players to unlock either characters or items through a series of pulls from a loot table that are usually funded by some unique currency that is either paid for with real-life money or can be acquired in-game by grinding. The rarity of an item or character generally determines how likely they are to be pulled, with higher value rewards having less likely chance to drop. Genshin Impact's gacha system brings no change to this formula, but there are a number of in-game systems that are not wholly reliant on gacha pulls for the player to progress. Leveling characters can be done by grinding for experience scrolls, and ascending them, which increases their level caps, can be done, as far as I know, by acquiring items in-game. However, the game does gate character passive abilities, expressed in-game as constellations, by requiring the player to draw multiple copies of the same character. Now, since this is a PvE-focused game, this locking of passive abilities, while unfortunate, does not strike me as something that will aggressively inhibit a player's progress that much. Weapons function much in the same way as characters do, but are leveled by either items or other weapons found in-game. Now, I have taken a look at the drop rates of some of the higher rarity characters and weapons in the game, and they are fairly low, which I suppose shouldn't be that surprising, but it is still somewhat disappointing. The inclusion of weapons within the loot table, along with the characters, dilutes the pool quite a bit as well, and more often than not I mainly drew weapons that would most likely serve as fodder for the items that I wished I drew instead. Then again, that is the nature of gacha games in general, so that is not a problem that is unique to Genshin Impact, but to gacha games as a whole. Primogen, which is the game's primary currency when it comes to the gacha system, can be acquired in-game. But the rate at which you do so is slow, and it can take a solid week of grinding to get enough for a large pull. This is a free-to-play game, and I suppose that the grind is designed to incentivize paying money for more pulls from the loot table, but at the same time it can feel very frustrating with how slow you are to progress any character abilities, especially when they're locked behind this gacha system, and this problem will only get worse for higher rarity items and characters. With all of this in mind, Genshin Impact strikes me as a game that has a significant amount of potential, but at the same time I am hesitant to say how much potential due to the presence of the game's gacha system. Now, I have played the game as a free-to-play player, but given the amount of content present within the game, I will say that dropping about $30 into this game would not be a significant waste of money. The combat is easy in practice, but rewards mastery due to its in-depth element system, and its exploration mechanics, while not perfect, do provide enough of a positive feedback loop that I frequently found myself lost within the game's world. Given that I haven't played the game in depth for too long, I can't cast a final judgment on its quality. However, for those of you that are looking for an action/exploration RPG, I'd say give this game a try and determine if it is worth you dropping money into. How far that money will take you will be random due to the gacha in place, but again, that is a problem with gacha games as a whole. I will at some point release a more in-depth review once I have played the game through some more, but for now, I can say that Genshin Impact has provided a fun and relaxing gameplay experience that will most likely take up a lot of my time in the days to come. On a more personal note, thank you to everyone that has watched this video to this point. I've always wanted to take a more critical eye to the medium that I love, and the moment I actually decided to make a video like this game happened across my path. Now, I know this is a first impressions video as opposed to an in-depth review, but I wanted to save that kind of video for when I had played the game for a much longer time. You can catch a full playthrough of the game with my raw reactions to it on my other channel, Critical Gaming. But until you decide to do that, or until my next video, thank you very much for your time, and have a very pleasant day.